My 8-year-old daughter was being brutally bullied at her new school because of her prosthetic leg. The kids called her Robot Girl and made her life hell. But when I complained to her teacher about the bullying, something incredible happened. But before I tell you this unbelievable story, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any of the incredible stories we share here. The moving truck pulled away from our new house in Burlington, Vermont on a gray October morning, taking with it the last physical connection to our old life in Phoenix. 6 months had passed since the accident that shattered Emma's left leg and my marriage in one devastating collision, but the emotional wreckage still felt fresh and raw. David had stayed behind in Arizona, claiming he needed time to process everything. Though we both knew he simply couldn't look at Emma's prosthetic without seeing his own failure to protect her. The divorce papers were still warm from the lawyer's printer when I made the decision to start over somewhere far from the ghost of our former happiness. Vermont had seemed like the perfect place to heal, quiet, safe, and far enough from the scene of our trauma that maybe we could finally breathe again. But as I watched 8-year-old Emma struggle up the front steps of our new home, her gait still uncertain despite months of physical therapy, I wondered if geography could really outrun grief. The purple accents on her prosthetic caught the dim sunlight, a splash of color that felt almost defiant against the overcast sky. The financial strain of Emma's medical care had forced us to downsize dramatically, trading our spacious Phoenix home for this modest 2-bedroom rental that smelled faintly of the previous tenant's cats. My savings account, once healthy enough to weather minor emergencies, had been decimated by hospital bills that insurance deemed partially covered, leaving us living paycheck to paycheck on my freelance graphic design income. The prosthetic alone had cost more than my car, and Emma was growing so quickly that Dr. Martinez warned we'd need adjustments every 6 months until she reached adolescence. I'd applied for grants and assistance programs, swallowing my pride to fill out forms that detailed our financial desperation in clinical terms. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was designing marketing materials for luxury brands while counting quarters for Emma's school lunch money. Every night, I lay awake calculating costs and timelines, wondering how long I could maintain this precarious balance before something would have to give. The weight of being Emma's sole protector and provider pressed down on me like a physical force, making even simple decisions feel monumentally important. Emma's adjustment to the prosthetic had been more challenging than anyone had prepared us for. The initial excitement over choosing the purple design had given way to phantom pain that kept her awake at night, and pressure sores that required constant monitoring and care. She'd developed a habit of unconsciously tugging at her skirts to ensure the prosthetic remained hidden, and her once confident stride had become hesitant and self-conscious. Physical therapy sessions often ended in tears of frustration when exercises that should have been simple proved unexpectedly difficult. The cheerful therapists spoke about adaptation periods and normal adjustment phases, but nothing felt normal about watching my daughter struggle with tasks that used to be second nature. Her drawings, once filled with princesses and rainbows, now featured stick figures with one leg prominently missing or differently colored. When I asked her about it, she simply said she was drawing real people like me. And my heart broke a little more. The child psychologist we'd seen in Phoenix had warned that depression was common in pediatric amputees, but I'd foolishly believed Emma's resilient spirit would carry her through unscathed. Burlington Elementary School loomed before us like a fortress of potential judgment, its red brick walls and perfectly manicured grounds projecting an image of wholesome New England tradition that both attracted and intimidated me. The principal, Mrs. Henderson, had been professionally accommodating during our enrollment meeting, but I'd caught her staring at Emma's prosthetic with the barely concealed fascination that we'd encountered so often in Phoenix. She assured me that the school had experience with special needs students, a phrase that made me wince every time someone applied it to my daughter. The building was fully accessible, she explained, with an elevator and designated bathrooms. Though the clinical way she discussed these accommodations made them sound more like accommodations for an inconvenience than basic human dignity. During our tour, I watched other children's reactions to Emma, noting how their eyes inevitably traveled to her prosthetic before quickly looking away with embarrassed curiosity. Their parents weren't much better, offering sympathetic smiles that felt more like pity than kindness. As we left that day, Emma asked quietly if the kids would be normal to her here, and I realized she'd internalized far more of the staring and whispers than I'd realized. The night before Emma's first day, I found her sitting on her bedroom floor surrounded by different outfits, systematically rejecting anything that might reveal her prosthetic. Her frustration was palpable as she discarded skirt after skirt, declaring them all too short or too twirly, even though they were the same clothes she'd worn confidently just months before. When I suggested her favorite purple dress, the one that matched her prosthetic's accents, she shook her head violently and insisted on long pants despite the September heat. The bedtime routine that had once been filled with stories and giggles became a tense negotiation about tomorrow's unknowns, with Emma extracting promises that I would come get her immediately if anyone was mean about her leg. I tucked her in with reassurances I didn't entirely feel, watching as she clutched her stuffed elephant, a get-well gift from the hospital that had become her constant companion. Her prayers that night included a request for the other kids to be kind and for her prosthetic to not be weird anymore. Words that cut through me like glass. As I closed her door, I realized I was sending my wounded daughter into another potential battlefield, armed with nothing but hope and my own desperate need for this move to be the right choice. Sleep eluded me that night, as I mentally rehearsed conversations with teachers about Emma's needs and prepared responses to questions that might come from curious children. I'd researched anti-bullying policies and accommodation laws until my eyes burned, trying to arm myself with knowledge that might protect Emma from the cruelties that seemed to follow children who were different. The house creaked and settled around us, still foreign and full of shadows that reminded me how alone we were in this new place. Every hour, I checked on Emma, finding her restless and mumbling in her sleep, her prosthetic propped against the nightstand like a soldier standing guard. The purple accents that had once represented hope and personality now seemed garish in the darkness, a beacon that would inevitably draw unwanted attention. I wondered if other single mothers felt this crushing weight of responsibility, this fear that every decision might be the wrong one that scarred their child forever. Dawn couldn't come fast enough, but when it did, I still felt unprepared for whatever awaited us at Burlington Elementary. The morning arrived gray and drizzling, matching my mood as I helped Emma into her carefully selected long pants and oversized sweater that effectively hid any sign of her prosthetic. She moved slowly and deliberately, checking her reflection multiple times to ensure nothing was visible, her anxiety manifesting in obsessive attention to details that had never mattered before. Breakfast was a silent affair, with Emma pushing scrambled eggs around her plate while I tried to project confidence I didn't feel. The school bus wasn't an option yet. Emma wasn't ready for that level of independence, so I bundled her into our aging Honda for the short drive that felt like crossing into enemy territory. As we pulled into the school parking lot, I saw groups of children laughing and playing with the effortless joy that Emma had once possessed, and I wondered if she would ever feel that carefree again. She gripped my hand tightly as we walked toward the entrance, her prosthetic completely hidden, but somehow still feeling exposed and vulnerable. This was our chance for a fresh start, but as we approached the building where Emma would spend the next crucial months of her childhood, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into the unknown with far more to lose than we could afford. The first week at Burlington Elementary passed in deceptive calm, with Emma reporting that her teacher was nice and her classmates were okay, responses that felt rehearsed and carefully neutral. Miss Carter, a woman in her early 30s with genuinely warm eyes and an easy laugh, seemed to understand Emma's need for space without making it obvious to the other children. She positioned Emma's desk strategically near the back corner where she could observe without feeling constantly watched, and never called attention to her slower movements during transitions between activities. The classroom atmosphere felt genuinely inclusive, with motivational posters about kindness and acceptance that seemed less performative than heartfelt. Emma's academic work was strong. She'd always been bright, But I noticed she never volunteered answers or participated in group discussions the way she had in Phoenix. During pickup each day, she emerged from the building with the same carefully composed expression, neither happy nor sad, just profoundly neutral in a way that worried me more than tears would have. When I asked about friends, she mentioned a few names but never with the enthusiasm that had once characterized her social connections. By the second week, subtle cracks began to appear in Emma's armor of normalcy. She started complaining of headaches in the morning and stomach aches by afternoon, classic signs of stress that I recognized from my own childhood experiences with anxiety. Her appetite decreased noticeably, and I found myself pleading with her to eat just a few more bites of foods that had previously been favorites. The long pants requirement never wavered, even on unseasonably warm days that had other children in shorts and t-shirts. And she'd developed a habit of sitting with her legs positioned to hide any potential outline of the prosthetic. Sleep became elusive for both of us. Emma because of restless nights filled with unnamed anxiety, and me because I spent hours listening for signs of distress from her room. Her drawings at home became increasingly sparse and geometric, lacking the vibrant creativity that had once filled sketchbook after sketchbook. When I suggested inviting a classmate over for a playdate, she quickly changed the subject, claiming she was too tired for friends right now. The isolation was becoming self-imposed, but I couldn't tell if it was protective or simply resigned. The breakthrough came during the third week when I arrived early for pickup and witnessed what Emma had been carefully omitting from her daily reports. I parked across the street and watched through the chain-link fence as children poured out of the building for afternoon recess, their voices carrying clearly across the playground. Emma emerged last, moving carefully down the steps while a group of boys clustered near the basketball court pointed in her direction and whispered among themselves. I couldn't hear their exact words, but their body language was unmistakably mocking, with one particularly tall boy exaggerating a limping walk that was clearly meant to imitate Emma's gait. The other children in the group laughed, and several began copying the cruel parody, creating a circle of humiliation around my daughter, who stood frozen near the building's entrance. My hands gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles went white, every maternal instinct screaming at me to intervene. But I forced myself to observe and document what Emma was facing daily. When the playground supervisor finally noticed and dispersed the group, the damage was already done. Emma spent the rest of recess sitting alone on a bench, staring at her hands while other children played around her. That evening, I decided to break through Emma's wall of protective silence, sitting on her bed after the usual bedtime routine and gently pressing for the truth about her school experience. Her resistance crumbled quickly once I mentioned seeing the playground incident, and the floodgates opened with heartbreaking honesty about the daily cruelties she'd been enduring. The boy leading the mockery was Tyler Morrison, whose father owned a local construction company and whose family had deep roots in Burlington's social hierarchy. Tyler had started the nickname Robo-Girl on Emma's second day, and it had spread through the fourth grade like wildfire, with children beeping at her in hallways and making mechanical sound effects when she walked by. Lunch was the worst time, she confided, because without structured activities, the social hierarchies became most apparent, and no one wanted to sit with the weird new girl with the fake leg. Some children asked invasive questions about whether it hurt or if she could feel anything, while others simply stared and whispered, treating her like a specimen to be studied rather than a person to be befriended. The gymnasium was particularly challenging because her careful concealment strategies were impossible during physical activities, making her differences unavoidably visible to classmates who had only suspected before. Emma's revelations continued in a rush of pent-up emotion that broke my heart into pieces I wasn't sure could be reassembled. She described elaborate strategies for avoiding attention, arriving at lunch late to minimize social interaction time, volunteering to help teachers during recess to avoid the playground, and even asking to use the bathroom during transitions to escape the hallway stairs. The constant hypervigilance was exhausting her, she explained, because every moment required careful monitoring of her prosthetic's visibility and her movements, naturalness. Some children had started placing bets on whether she would stumble during different activities, turning her physical challenges into entertainment that felt deliberately cruel. The worst part, she whispered through tears, was overhearing parents at pickup discussing her condition in hushed tones, using words like tragic and unfortunate, that made her feel like something broken that deserved pity rather than friendship. When I asked why she hadn't told me sooner, she simply said she thought if she was good enough and quiet enough, maybe the attention would stop and we could stay in Burlington instead of moving again. Her desire to protect me from disappointment had led her to suffer in silence, carrying burdens no 8-year-old should bear alone. The conversation lasted well past her usual bedtime, with Emma finally releasing weeks of accumulated pain and fear in a cathartic flood of honesty. She admitted to fantasizing about having her old leg back, not because the prosthetic was limiting her physically, but because it made her a target for cruelties she'd never experienced before the accident. The social isolation was worse than the physical challenges, she explained, because at least the prosthetic could be improved with adjustments and practice, but she had no idea how to fix the way people looked at her with mixtures of curiosity, pity, and discomfort. Some children had asked if her condition was contagious, while others avoided her entirely as if disability might somehow transfer through proximity. The cafeteria was particularly challenging because the acoustics amplified whispers about her robot leg and speculation about how it worked, making every meal feel like a performance she hadn't auditioned for. When Tyler Morrison's group started timing how long it took her to navigate stairs, turning her mobility into a competitive spectacle, she began taking longer routes to avoid them entirely. By the time she finished telling me everything, we were both emotionally drained. But I finally understood the scope of what we were facing and why Emma had become so withdrawn and protective. The next morning, I called Burlington Elementary and scheduled an emergency meeting with Mrs. Henderson and Miss Carter, my mama bear instincts fully activated by Emma's revelations. The secretary was accommodating but not particularly surprised by my request, suggesting that adjustment issues were common for new students, especially those with special circumstances. Her casual dismissal of what amounted to systematic harassment made my blood boil, but I forced myself to remain professional in my tone while insisting on the earliest possible appointment. As I hung up the phone, I realized that our fresh start in Vermont was turning into another battleground. But this time I was armed with information and determination that hadn't been available during the chaos following Emma's accident. The meeting was scheduled for the following afternoon, giving me time to document incidents and prepare a comprehensive account of the bullying Emma had endured. That night, as I watched my daughter sleep fitfully despite her emotional release, I made a silent promise that things would change, whatever the cost. The innocence we'd lost in Phoenix wouldn't be further sacrificed to the casual cruelty of children who saw her difference as entertainment, rather than simply another aspect of human diversity that deserved respect and acceptance. Mrs. Henderson's office felt sterile and bureaucratic, filled with educational awards and policy manuals that spoke to administrative competence but not necessarily compassion. She greeted me with professional courtesy, tinged by the wariness of someone who'd handled many difficult parent meetings. Her smile practiced but not quite reaching her eyes. Miss Carter arrived a few minutes later, carrying Emma's work folder and wearing an expression of genuine concern that immediately distinguished her from her supervisor's measured responses. As I laid out the systematic harassment Emma had been experiencing, providing specific dates, names, and witnessed incidents, Mrs. Henderson took careful notes while making non-committal sounds of acknowledgement. Her responses felt rehearsed, mentions of anti-bullying policies, inclusion training, and the challenges of monitoring every playground interaction. But Miss Carter's reaction was more visceral, her face reflecting genuine distress as I described the daily humiliations my daughter had endured. The meeting proceeded along predictable lines, with assurances of investigation and intervention that felt more procedural than passionate. I found myself growing frustrated with the administrative approach to what felt like an emergency, requiring immediate and decisive action. When I finished my account, Miss Carter asked to see recent photos of Emma's prosthetic, explaining that understanding its design might help her address misconceptions and curiosity among the students more effectively. I pulled out my phone and showed her the images I'd taken during recent adjustment appointments, including close-ups of the mechanical components and the purple accents that had once brought Emma such joy. Miss Carter studied the photos with an intensity that seemed unusual for an elementary school teacher, asking technical questions about materials and functionality that demonstrated surprising knowledge about prosthetic engineering. Her expertise seemed to go beyond casual interest, and I found myself wondering about her background while she examined each image with what appeared to be professional familiarity. When she asked about the manufacturer and specific model information, her voice carried an undertone I couldn't quite identify, something between recognition and emotional connection that seemed oddly personal. Mrs. Henderson appeared equally puzzled by her colleague's detailed interest, glancing between us with obvious curiosity about where this conversation was heading. Miss Carter's hands began to tremble slightly as she continued examining the photos, and I noticed her breathing had become more shallow and controlled. She excused herself briefly, stepping into the hallway while Mrs. Henderson and I sat in confused silence, wondering what had triggered such an unexpected reaction. When she returned, her composure was restored, but her eyes were red-rimmed in a way that suggested she'd been crying in the hallway. She sat down slowly and looked directly at me with an expression that combined professional interest with something much more personal and painful. The atmosphere in the room had shifted dramatically, transforming from a routine administrative meeting into something that felt emotionally charged and significant. Even Mrs. Henderson seemed to sense the change, leaning forward with obvious curiosity about what was happening between Miss Carter and the prosthetic images. Miss Carter took a deep breath and began to speak in a voice that was carefully controlled but unmistakably emotional, suggesting that whatever she was about to reveal would change the entire dynamic of our situation. "Mrs. Thompson," Miss Carter began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to share something that will probably sound impossible, but Emma's prosthetic? It's bringing back memories I've spent 3 years trying to forget." She paused, gathering herself before continuing with obvious difficulty. "I wasn't always a teacher. I used to be a biomedical engineer specializing in pediatric prosthetics, and I worked extensively with this exact model and manufacturer." Her revelation hung in the air like a charged particle, transforming the mundane meeting into something far more significant and personal. She continued, explaining that she'd left engineering after a devastating personal loss that made continuing in the field too emotionally painful to bear. The transition to teaching had been her way of staying connected to children while avoiding the daily reminders of technology she'd once been passionate about creating. Seeing Emma's prosthetic had brought back not just professional memories, but deeply personal ones that she'd thought were safely buried beneath her new career and identity. The coincidence felt too significant to be random, she said, though she couldn't yet explain why fate had brought Emma into her classroom specifically. The story that emerged over the next 30 minutes was both heartbreaking and eerily parallel to our own experience. Miss Carter had been engaged to a fellow engineer named Michael, who had an 8-year-old daughter named Sophie from his previous marriage. Sophie had lost her leg in a skiing accident, and Miss Carter had thrown herself into creating the perfect prosthetic design for her future stepdaughter, working nights and weekends to develop innovations that would give Sophie confidence and optimal mobility. The project had consumed her for months, representing not just professional achievement, but a deeply personal mission to help the child she'd come to love as her own. 2 weeks before their wedding, Michael and Sophie were killed in a car accident while driving to pick up Sophie's new prosthetic, the very model that Miss Carter had designed specifically for her. The irony was devastating. The technology meant to improve Sophie's life had become the destination that led to her death. Miss Carter had quit engineering immediately after the funeral, unable to continue creating devices for other children when her own surrogate daughter would never benefit from her work. The grief had been too overwhelming to bear, and teaching had offered an escape from the daily reminders of loss and failure. Mrs. Henderson sat in stunned silence as Miss Carter revealed the depth of her connection to prosthetic technology and the trauma that had driven her career change. The meeting had transformed from a routine bullying complaint into an emotionally charged revelation that none of us had anticipated or prepared for. Miss Carter's tears were flowing freely now as she explained how seeing Emma had brought back not just memories of Sophie, but also recognition of the passion for helping children that had driven her original career choice. She realized that her attempt to escape her past had ultimately led her exactly where she needed to be, in a position to help another little girl facing similar challenges to the one she'd lost. The connection felt too profound to be coincidental, she said, and she wondered if perhaps Sophie's spirit had somehow guided Emma to her classroom. Her voice broke as she admitted that she'd been struggling with depression and purposelessness since leaving engineering. But meeting Emma had reminded her that running from pain didn't eliminate it. It only prevented the healing that could come from transforming tragedy into purpose. The revelation hung in the air like a bridge between our separate griefs, connecting two women who'd lost pieces of themselves to circumstances beyond their control. As Miss Carter composed herself and Mrs. Henderson processed this unexpected turn in our meeting, I realized that our complaint about bullying had uncovered something much more significant and potentially transformative. Miss Carter's technical expertise combined with her emotional investment in Emma's success could provide exactly the kind of advocacy and understanding that my daughter needed to thrive in this environment. The teacher's revelation explained her immediate interest in Emma and her sophisticated questions about the prosthetic. But more importantly, it suggested that Emma had found someone who understood her challenges from both professional and personal perspectives. Mrs. Henderson, clearly moved by her colleague's story, immediately began discussing ways to leverage Miss Carter's expertise in addressing the bullying situation and educating the students about prosthetic technology. The meeting concluded with concrete plans for classroom presentations and anti-bullying interventions. But more significantly, it had forged an unexpected alliance between two women who understood that sometimes the most meaningful connections arise from the deepest losses. As we scheduled follow-up meetings and discussed implementation strategies, I felt hope blooming in my chest for the first time since Emma's struggles began, sensing that Emma's struggle had led us to exactly the right person at exactly the right moment. Miss Carter's first attempt to address the bullying through a classroom presentation about prosthetic technology met with mixed and initially disappointing results. While some children showed genuine curiosity and asked thoughtful questions about how the devices worked, Tyler Morrison and his core group remained skeptical and resistant to changing their attitudes. The presentation itself was technically impressive, with Miss Carter demonstrating various prosthetic models and explaining the engineering principles behind them. But changing hearts required more than scientific education. Emma participated reluctantly, still wearing long pants that concealed her prosthetic, and answered questions in barely audible whispers that suggested she remained deeply uncomfortable with the attention. Several children seemed genuinely interested in the technology, but playground dynamics didn't immediately shift. And Emma reported that the teasing continued in more subtle forms that were harder for teachers to detect and address. Tyler's group had simply become more sophisticated in their cruelty, using inside jokes and coded language that maintained their power dynamic while appearing innocent to adult observers. The initial intervention felt like a partial success that highlighted how deeply embedded the social hierarchies had become. The real breakthrough came 2 weeks later, when Emma finally reached her breaking point during a particularly cruel incident in the cafeteria. Tyler Morrison had convinced several children to start dropping their lunch trays when Emma walked by, claiming they were practicing their robot moves, in obvious reference to her prosthetic. The orchestrated clattering was designed to draw attention to Emma's passage through the lunch line, creating a spectacle that humiliated her while appearing accidental to supervising adults. On this particular day, Emma stopped in the middle of the cafeteria, pulled up her pant leg to fully reveal her prosthetic, and announced in a clear, strong voice that she was tired of hiding and tired of being treated like a freak for something that made her special, not broken. The cafeteria fell silent as Emma explained how her prosthetic was more advanced than anything Tyler or his friends could build, and challenged them to try walking with one leg if they thought it was so easy and funny. Her spontaneous speech was raw and emotional, but also powerful and confident in a way that commanded respect rather than pity. Miss Carter, who happened to be on lunch duty that day, watched with tears in her eyes as Emma finally found her voice and refused to be ashamed of her differences any longer. Emma's public stand marked the beginning of a gradual but genuine shift in classroom dynamics. Though the process was far from smooth or linear, some children were immediately won over by her courage and began approaching her with genuine friendship rather than morbid curiosity. But others remained resistant to changing their established social positions. Tyler Morrison's reaction was particularly complex, clearly threatened by Emma's newfound confidence, but also seemingly impressed by her courage in a way that began to undermine his previous cruelty. Miss Carter seized on this moment to implement more structured interventions, including peer mediation sessions and collaborative projects designed to break down social barriers and encourage empathy. The process required constant vigilance and frequent course corrections, with some days showing clear progress and others featuring setbacks that reminded us how fragile children's social connections could be. Emma's own confidence fluctuated dramatically during this period, with moments of genuine pride in her prosthetic alternating with episodes of self-doubt and desire to retreat into her previous protective strategies. The journey toward acceptance was proving to be exactly that, a journey rather than a destination. 3 months into the school year, a significant turning point occurred when Emma's prosthetic malfunctioned during a science experiment, creating an opportunity for Miss Carter to demonstrate her technical expertise in real time. The hydraulic system that controlled the ankle joint began leaking fluid, causing Emma's gait to become noticeably unstable and threatening to create another opportunity for mockery. Instead of hiding the problem or calling for parent pickup, Miss Carter calmly announced that this was an excellent opportunity to see prosthetic engineering in action, and she proceeded to diagnose and temporarily repair the issue using tools from the classroom science kit. The children watched in fascination as their teacher explained pressure systems and mechanical engineering while fixing Emma's leg with the competence of someone who clearly understood the technology intimately. Tyler Morrison, whose own father worked in construction and had taught him to respect skilled craftsmanship, was visibly impressed by Miss Carter's expertise and began asking genuine technical questions rather than mocking ones. The incident transformed Emma's prosthetic from a source of shame into a demonstration of cutting-edge technology that even the most resistant children had to acknowledge was genuinely impressive and complex. The social transformation that followed was gradual but increasingly sustainable, built on understanding rather than simple behavioral compliance. Miss Carter organized a Future Engineers Club that met during lunch recess, providing Emma with a structured social environment where her technical knowledge about prosthetics made her a valuable contributor rather than an object of curiosity. Tyler Morrison joined the club within a week, drawn by genuine interest in engineering and perhaps by recognition that his previous behavior had been based on ignorance rather than any real understanding of what Emma's prosthetic represented. Other children followed, creating a core group of friends who saw Emma's differences as interesting rather than threatening or amusing. The bullying didn't disappear entirely, but it became increasingly isolated and socially unacceptable within the classroom community that Miss Carter had carefully cultivated. Emma's confidence grew steadily as she realized that her prosthetic could be a conversation starter rather than a conversation stopper, and she began wearing shorter pants and skirts that revealed the purple accents she'd once been so proud of. The journey from victim to confident advocate had taken months rather than days, but the foundation felt solid because it was built on genuine relationships rather than adult-imposed behavioral requirements. By spring, Emma had not only found her place in the Burlington elementary community, but had become something of a celebrity among younger students who saw her prosthetic as genuinely cool rather than pitiable. She started visiting kindergarten and first-grade classrooms to talk about differences and inclusion, accompanied by Miss Carter, who provided technical explanations that satisfied children's natural curiosity while promoting understanding and acceptance. The anti-bullying program they developed together became a model for other schools in the district, with Emma serving as a student advocate who could speak from personal experience about both the pain of exclusion and the power of acceptance. Tyler Morrison had become one of her closest friends. Their relationship transformed from antagonistic to genuinely supportive as he learned to channel his natural leadership abilities toward inclusion rather than exclusion. The friendship felt authentic rather than forced, built on shared interests and mutual respect that had grown out of understanding rather than guilt or adult intervention. Miss Carter often remarked that watching their friendship develop had restored her faith in children's capacity for growth and change, reminding her that education at its best was about transformation rather than simple information transfer. The school year concluded with Emma receiving the Courage Award at the annual assembly, recognition that felt earned rather than compensatory and celebrated her growth rather than simply acknowledging her challenges. As I watched her walk confidently across the stage, her prosthetic visible and her head held high, I reflected on how dramatically our lives had changed since that first terrifying day when I'd dropped her off at Burlington Elementary. Miss Carter sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face as she watched Emma accept her award with the confidence that months of patient advocacy and genuine friendship had helped cultivate. The journey from isolation to integration had been longer and more complex than I'd initially hoped, but the foundation felt solid because it was built on real relationships and authentic understanding rather than superficial tolerance. Emma's transformation from victim to advocate had taught all of us that the most meaningful changes require time, patience, and the courage to be vulnerable enough to let others see our authentic selves. As we prepared for summer break and the promise of 5th grade in the fall, I knew that we'd finally found not just a school, but a community where Emma could continue growing into the confident, capable young woman I'd always known she could become. 2 years later, as I watched Emma help a tearful first grader named Marcus adjust to his new prosthetic arm during recess, I marveled at how naturally she had grown into her role as Burlington Elementary's unofficial peer mentor for children facing physical challenges. Emma, now 10 and radiating quiet confidence that came from hard-won self-acceptance, knelt beside the 6-year-old who had been struggling with other children's stares and questions since returning to school after his accident. Her voice was gentle but matter-of-fact as she showed Marcus the purple accents on her prosthetic leg and explained how she'd learned that the weird looks usually came from curiosity rather than meanness, and that most kids just needed time to understand that different didn't mean scary. Miss Carter watched from across the playground, no longer fighting tears but smiling with the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed genuine transformation through patient nurturing rather than dramatic intervention. The girl who had once hidden her prosthetic under long pants was now confidently wearing shorts that showcased the technology she'd learned to see as remarkable rather than shameful. Her role as a mentor had evolved organically as other families with children facing similar challenges heard about Burlington Elementary's inclusive environment and specifically requested placement in Miss Carter's classroom. Emma's advocacy work had begun modestly during 5th grade when Mrs. Henderson asked her to speak at a district-wide assembly about bullying prevention, but it had grown into something more meaningful and sustainable over time. She had become the go-to student mentor for newly enrolled children with visible differences, helping them navigate everything from playground dynamics to cafeteria seating arrangements with the wisdom that came from personal experience. The program that had emerged was entirely school-based and age-appropriate, with Emma serving as a hi buddy who could answer questions and provide emotional support during the crucial first weeks when social hierarchies were still forming. Her approach was refreshingly practical and honest, focusing on real-world strategies like how to respond to stares, what to say when kids asked invasive questions, and how to find your tribe among classmates who saw past surface differences. The impact was measurable in terms of faster integration times and fewer reported bullying incidents, but more importantly, It had given Emma a sense of purpose that transcended her personal challenges. Miss Carter had formalized the program enough to ensure continuity and proper supervision, but the heart of it remained Emma's authentic peer-to-peer connection that no adult could replicate. Miss Carter's own journey had been equally meaningful, as working with Emma had helped her find a way to honor Sophie's memory while building something positive for other children facing similar challenges. She had completed additional training in assistive technology and become Burlington Elementary's resident expert on accommodating students with physical differences, but her approach remained deeply personal rather than purely clinical. Her classroom had become known throughout the district as a place where children with disabilities could expect not just accommodation, but genuine understanding and advocacy. The engineering skills she'd once used to design prosthetics were now applied to creating classroom adaptations and teaching strategies that helped all students succeed regardless of their physical capabilities. Her collaboration with Emma had reminded her that technical expertise was most valuable when combined with emotional intelligence and genuine caring about individual needs. The depression and sense of purposelessness that had driven her from engineering had been replaced by a quieter but deeper satisfaction that came from daily engagement with the children she was helping, rather than abstract technological achievements. Tyler Morrison's transformation from antagonist to ally remained one of the most remarkable aspects of Emma's story, demonstrating that authentic relationships could grow from the most unlikely beginnings when nurtured by patient adults and genuine shared experiences. He had become not just Emma's friend, but her strongest defender, using his natural leadership abilities and social influence to create an environment where differences were respected rather than mocked. His engineering interests, initially sparked by Emma's prosthetic technology, had evolved into a genuine passion for problem-solving that manifested in everything from science fair projects to peer mediation skills. During middle school, he and Emma had started an informal Tech Helpers group that designed simple solutions for classmates with various challenges, creating practical innovations while building empathy and understanding among participants. His relationship with Emma had taught him that true leadership meant protecting others rather than dominating them, and he'd become a powerful voice against bullying throughout their school community. The friendship that had grown from their early conflict demonstrated that the most meaningful relationships often require working through genuine differences rather than avoiding them entirely. The broader impact of Emma's story had remained appropriately local but genuinely significant within the Burlington community. Her success had inspired 3 other families with children with disabilities to move to the district specifically for the inclusive environment that Miss Carter had helped create. The peer mentoring program had been adopted by the 2 other elementary schools in town, with Emma occasionally visiting as a training consultant who could share her experiences with new student mentors. Local pediatric prosthetic specialists had begun referring their young patients to Burlington Elementary when families were looking for inclusive school environments, creating a small but meaningful reputation for excellence in accommodation and acceptance. A feature article in the local newspaper about the school's inclusion program had generated interest from neighboring districts, leading to informal visits and information sharing that spread best practices throughout the region. While the impact remained local, it was deep and sustainable, creating lasting change in the lives of specific children and families, rather than pursuing broader but more superficial recognition. As Emma concluded her conversation with Marcus by promising to introduce him to Tyler and the other kids in their lunch group, I reflected on how much our definition of success had evolved since those dark early days in Burlington. We had moved to Vermont hoping simply to escape trauma and find acceptance, but we had discovered something much more valuable: the opportunity to transform personal pain into meaningful service to others facing similar challenges. Emma's prosthetic, once a source of shame and isolation, had become the foundation for genuine friendships and purposeful work that improved daily life for other children who needed to know they weren't alone. Miss Carter's integration of engineering expertise with educational passion had created a model for inclusive teaching that was being quietly replicated by colleagues who saw its effectiveness firsthand. The relationships that had grown from crisis and conflict had demonstrated that authentic connections often require patience, vulnerability, and the willingness to see past surface differences to the shared humanity underneath. As we drove home from school that day, Emma already planning how to introduce Marcus to her friend group and discussing strategies for helping him feel more confident, I realized that our journey had taught us that healing wasn't just about surviving difficult experiences. It was about finding ways to ensure that others didn't have to face those challenges alone. The teacher who had understood Sophie's challenges through loss had become the person who helped Emma learn that her differences could become her greatest strengths, not through grand gestures or dramatic interventions, but through daily acts of understanding, advocacy, and authentic human connection. Looking ahead to Emma's final year at Burlington Elementary and her transition to middle school, I felt confident that the foundation we had built would serve her well regardless of what challenges the future might bring. Her prosthetic technology would continue evolving, her mentoring skills would keep developing, and her impact on other children would naturally expand as she gained more experience and wisdom. Miss Carter would remain a mentor and friend, their professional collaboration a testament to the power of relationships between teachers and students that extend beyond classroom walls while remaining appropriate and sustainable. Tyler and Emma's friendship would provide a model for their peers about the possibility of authentic connection across differences that initially seem significant but prove superficial when overcome by shared interests and mutual respect. The programs they had developed together would continue helping other children long after they had moved on to new schools and challenges, creating a legacy of inclusion that honored their individual struggles while serving a greater good. Most importantly, Emma had learned that her worth wasn't diminished by her differences, but actually enhanced by her willingness to be authentically herself while helping others find the courage to do the same. If this story touched your heart as much as it did mine, leave a comment below telling us what you thought. We love reading each and every one of your comments, and they really make a difference to us. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And look, there's another incredible video appearing on your screen with a story that will leave you speechless. Click here and I'll be waiting for you there.